All right, welcome back. We're doing the fourth month of this Foundations project, and this one was focused on food or eating better. And I'm here joined again with my wife, Zaritza, and we're going to talk a little bit about, what we were doing for the last month and all that stuff.
I'm excited for this.
Yeah.
It's good. We get to talk about
everyone's going to listen to us
and
talk just for like month after month, just having our conversations about all the little minutiae in our life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get this started.
Let's go. Yeah.
What do you want to tell me about food?
Yeah.
Do you want to, let's talk about kind of what your past is with food and
Yeah.
all
yeah.
your,
I mean, it's
all your allergies.
Oh, my allergies. You're making me sound so awful. Yeah. My situation is a little unusual because when I was a baby, I was like diagnosed with like kind of severe nut allergies, and I was also until I was like in my late 20s, I was also allergic to milk, and so I kind of when I was growing up, I always had to be very careful, and there was lots of food that I couldn't eat.
Yeah.
And so it makes me the fun person to have at parties. No, but I think that kind of background made sort of food and making food choices sort of always something that was present in my life. And then when I was a teenager, I got really interested in a lot of arguments for having a more like vegetarian lifestyle. So I was a big fan of Steve Pavlina's blog, and he kind of pointed me to books like T. Colin Campbell's The China Study, which was sort of arguing that you should have this vegetarian lifestyle. Today, I'm not vegetarian. Today, I eat eggs, dairy, and fish and seafood products. But I think the basic argument kind of pointed me down this sort of direction of like being more interested in the connection between diet and health. And like maybe we can get into also how some of my opinions on that have changed over the last decades, in particular like a lot of the research I was doing on this month and before. And then in terms of like more recent history, at the beginning of this project when I was focusing on fitness, it felt very natural to also pay attention to like what I was eating and eat a little bit better and do that kind of thing. And so that was also some changes that I was making just even in the last couple months. So I don't know, it's sort of an interesting kind of journey and starting point. Like I think it's different for me than it would be for a lot of people. And so obviously, you know, if you don't have that particular background, you may not arrive at the same place that I do with making some of these choices. But I think for most of us, we can probably benefit from being a little bit more mindful about what we eat, because even if you don't, again, follow the exact same plan as someone else, it's pretty clear that like the default options in our environment are pretty bad. Like most food that, you know, go to a restaurant is probably way higher in salt and saturated fat and refined carbohydrates than it should be for health. And, you know, you go to the grocery store, it's all ultra processed foods that are, probably not the best for you. And this kind of shows sort of at the kind of societal level when you look at statistics on obesity, type 2 diabetes, all these sorts of diet-related diseases. I mean, I'm not saying anything that I think anyone would really be surprised about or object about, but I think it's hard because this environment is so omnipresent that choosing a good way to eat can be challenging, I think.
It can be, but it's also not always easy to figure out what is the right way to eat, what you like to eat. And it all sort of goes back to kind of how we were raised. And I think what food means to us. I think for me, food is such a big part of my culture. And the food that I was like raised eating, oftentimes, like if I look back on my childhood, my mom made everything at home. Everything was made from scratch, and I think I always had a very healthy relationship with food. We didn't really have that much snacks at home. We always just kind of bought our groceries as we needed them. We went to the markets a lot, and we ate homemade meals. And I think for me, that was something that I really struggled with once I moved out of my parents' house, is that my mom often cooked everything. Like, I mean, I knew how to cook some things, but I wasn't a good cook when I moved out of my parents. And so I kind of had to learn that by myself and learn what I like cooking. And and I would constantly call my mom and ask her for recipes and kind of figure out what I like to eat. But do you think that having your allergies affected your relationship with food? How do you...
I mean, well, it definitely made me kind of mindful of what I was eating in a way that, like, I don't know. I think, I mean, this is a separate point, but I think like we're just so driven by the kind of default in your environment. So if you show up somewhere and that they're having a certain food at like a party or this kind of thing that you're attending, you didn't choose the food, but you're going to eat whatever's there, kind of, I think is what most people gravitate towards. And for me, just because my whole childhood, I couldn't do that. Like I couldn't actually just like go and just eat whatever. Like I, you know, especially because the milk allergy, milk is in lots of products. Right. And so I had to be very cautious about that. And so I think that just creates a bit of a different relationship. You always sort of stand apart a little bit because you're always going to be eating things that are a little bit different for other people. And so I think that probably was one of the reasons why when I was in my sort of late teens and I got kind of sold this idea that, oh, you know, being vegetarian was really good for your health, it was a lot easier for me to stick to that because I had kind of already been doing that. Like I'd already been sort of being like, well, I can't have that and I can't have that when I would go to sort of other people's places and this kind of thing. And I think it's, you know, it's funny you brought up kind of like your culture, because like when we started dating, I feel like it was... your culture plays such a large role in how you think about food and how you think about eating that it was very interesting for me how like sometimes we would have like different, not beliefs, but like kind of background assumptions about eating things that are just totally different. So like, you know, just like, I don't know, there was...
I didn't want to make beans in the middle of the summer.
Well, not that. I was thinking about, well, that's true too. But yeah, I mean, didn't want the house to get too hot. That was something I thought was funny at first.
Who cooks beans in the middle of summer? You have to, because the way we make beans, my Macedonian friends will understand this. It's gravče na tavče. You have to boil them for a couple of hours. Then you have to bake them for like an hour and then uncovered for like another half an hour. So you just don't do that. And where I come from too, winter is pretty cold, but then summers are like plus 40 Celsius degrees. And so most of your summer you end up eating like salads and things that are don't need to be cooked, or just things that are quick to prepare, because it's just so hot and you don't want to spend that time in the kitchen. Whereas like in winter, it's more hearty soups and things that, you know, that take a little bit of time, but they're kind of warm and nice.
Well, I was even going to say, not even just about that one in particular, but just the fact that like your culture, the eating pattern tends to be like having like a bigger meal sort of early afternoon.
Oh, right.
And then just having like kind of like meze type stuff in the evening, which again, for like growing up, like dinner was the meal. Like that was the big meal. Like lunch you could almost skip if you didn't want to have it. But then you'd have like 6, 7 p.m. you'd have a big meal. And or even like what you put in the food, like what the food is and this kind of thing is different. And so it's interesting for me because these sort of early life experiences so strongly influence what you think is normal and what you think is like acceptable, that I think food is it's not like other kinds of habits where you can just sort of like, okay, well, I'm going to just change everything wholesale to something totally different, because you have these really deep emotional, cultural, kind of habitual connections to certain ways of eating. And so I can definitely see for people who, you know, if you grew up like I did in North America, and maybe, you know, there were certain choices that were kind of common around you when you were growing up, it can be hard to make those transitions later if the way you learn to like eat, for instance, like if you just like always have Coke or Pepsi at home, like that's just sort of what you always have at home. So you can always have Coke or Pepsi to drink and you like it because it's, you know, tastes nice. Then it's hard to tell someone like, oh, well, you probably shouldn't be drinking so much Coke or Pepsi. Or like if you always have junk food in the house because it's nice to have chips or cookies or this kind of thing. That can be very hard if you have these sort of emotional connections to it. So I don't know if we want to talk a little bit about like what we learned and what kind of changes we've been working on in our own house for food. But I just think that's something that I was really trying to keep in mind when I was thinking about this month, is that it's not like exercise where you can just tell people, okay, you know, find some way to move 30 minutes every day.
No.
And even if you're from a completely different culture, it's fine. Food is so personal and cultural and specific that I just there is no universal recommendation. You just have to find something that meets those simultaneous constraints of it's healthy enough and it's convenient enough and it fits enough with your preferences that you're actually going to stick with it for more than 30 days.
And that's the thing too. Sometimes us as partners, we do eat differently.
Yeah.
So Scott, you're technically pescatarian,
I guess,
right?
Yeah.
Because you eat fish, but
seafood,
you don't. You don't eat any other type of meat.
No.
Whereas I do.
Yeah.
And our kids do. Well, at least my son, the little one, she's still experiencing. She's still learning to eat. Yeah. But we eat that type of protein.
Yeah.
And so a lot of we don't. I don't know how to say. It's hard sometimes. Yeah. But it has kind of taken us years to figure it out and to figure out the meal planning where everyone is happy and healthy and satisfied with the meals that we make. Because that was, I think, one thing that was a little bit of a struggle when we started dating. Yeah. And then the solution, which was not really a good solution, but I think the solution that we came up with is that we're just going to eat out more. And so then Scott can choose whatever he wants to eat, and then I'll choose whatever I want to eat. But then we both ended up gaining weight when we started dating because we were just eating so much.
I don't know whether it was just because of that reason. I think it was also
just
because
that reason.
We were joking that when 10 years ago we started dating, and both of us have been very skinny in our 20s, and so we weren't we didn't have that proper fear of overeating and gaining weight and stuff. Yeah. And so we started dating, and the joke was, oh, we're in love now, and so we're just we're just getting ordering pizza and having cookies and just who cares,
we're happy we
found our soulmate. Time to just eat whatever we want. And so that was a bit of an inside joke, but I mean it was something that I think okay.
I don't know if I should share it.
Oh yeah, sure.
The nicknames for each other.
Oh
we named each other Blob number 1 and Blob number 2.
Yeah, I was Blob 1. But we were in love, and we were also staying at your apartment in Winnipeg, and it was in the winter time, so we weren't doing a lot of moving around or hibernating.
And pizza and
so that wasn't great. I mean, we've eaten better since then, and I feel like a lot of stuff has improved. But I think figuring out what to eat also now that we have kids is another thing. As anyone knows, 3 to 4 year olds, if you don't know, 3 to 4 year olds, turns out they can be quite picky eaters. And so this kind of how do you find something that works for everyone? I mean, that was very much on my mind when I started this, because I knew I wanted to eat healthier. I knew that, again, going back to definitely eating healthier than I was when we started dating, but but even just in the recent history, recognizing I haven't always been making healthy choices. I'd be I'd skip breakfast, and then I'd be hungry by 11. So I'd be going and get a scone and a latte from, Starbucks just because I'm hungry and I've got to work. And so making these sort of bad food choices in general, I knew I wanted to improve those behaviors. But at the same time, I was also kind of aware that being too strict, being too stringent could also put friction on us and our family and how we're trying to do things together. I definitely didn't want to be okay, well, here's 400 things that we can't eat now, and then then I'm cooking some totally separate meal. So
I don't think that's healthy. I don't think that's the thing for me. Food is it's not even just about the food. It's the time that we have together and coming together for dinner and all of us sitting down and having a meal together and talking about our day. That's such an important thing that I think that's healthy, right? It's not just about the food. It's about the time that you're spending together, preparing the food, eating the food. I think what makes you unhealthy is deciding to just be either eating out or constantly ordering in food. I think as soon as you decide to prepare your food at home,
Yeah.
That right there, that
difference,
decision right there is going to make it healthier, and you're going to feel better about eating that food.
Yeah. And I think some other shifts that we kind of worked on, and this isn't something that just happened this month, but even starting, like, as I mentioned, kind of when I was doing the fitness month, I kind of already started reading and getting interested in this. And so I was making some shifts. But some things that we've done, I have been trying to change kind of the food environment at home so that, again, we don't feel like we have to eat out as much because we have stuff that's easy to make at home that's relatively healthy. But things like, we always have the frozen broccoli now. Like, the kids actually like frozen broccoli, which is weird that they're very picky, but they like the microwave broccoli. But like, that's something that you just throw it in there, it takes 5 minutes, and you have, broccoli. Or like we have the edamame now. I now make sure that I have like, tin tuna, salmon, sardines. And just in case I want to bring lunch to work and I don't have anything, then I have something. Because that was something I recognized for myself. I didn't have anything in the fridge. It would take me too long to prepare lunch. So I'd come to the office. I don't have anything. And then it would be like, well, what's nearby? Well, there's Subway, Chipotle, getting a sandwich at the store. And I mean, it is possible to eat at those places more healthfully. So I don't want to say it's, devoid of a nutritional value, but it is one of those things where you're kind of, if you're doing that regularly, you're just tilting yourself towards making it a little bit less healthy than you could otherwise. And so making it easy to prepare things at home, I think, like, again, this is the low hanging fruit. I feel like that's to avoid the excessive fruit metaphors here, but like the low hanging fruit of eating healthier is, how do you make it easier for you to eat healthier? Not how do you layer on tons of rules about like what you can and can't eat? Just changing your environment so that whatever the default options that surround you are just like of a generally higher quality. And then if you like every once in a while you treat yourself or you go out for a meal, or, I mean, after we have this conversation, we have, we're probably going to have a work lunch that's not going to be as healthy as it would have been if I had prepared something at home. But I mean, if it's only once in a while, it's not nearly as bad as if this is just like an everyday thing because you're lazy or because you haven't planned ahead. So I think that really the preparation and the planning is the big thing that that we've been trying to improve upon,
Yeah, I think the planning is key. Yeah, because and then you're once you're in the routine to be constantly getting food from coffee shops or restaurants or whatever for lunch, or even ordering in for dinner, that's kind of your status quo. But then but when you have this plan, and we've been like, so we always have like chickpeas, you've been preparing some different types of grains and beans during the weekend, so then if we want to throw, we can easily throw a bowl together, and it's delicious and it's really, really good for you. So that's something that we've been doing. That I really like.
I mean, that was one of the things. I don't know whether we want to get into the specific like dietary recommendations that I encountered when I was reading the research, but one of the things that that came up from that was that like having whole grain sort of carbohydrate options is a lot better than what we typically have. So some of the easy shifts were like just buying whole wheat bread and whole wheat tortillas,
whole wheat pasta,
and whole wheat pasta, which took a little while to get the kids on it, but I think I've got them eating it now.
Scott cooked pasta at home yesterday, actually, and he's cooking whole wheat. And I know my son prefers the white pasta. And so I'm like, are you making a separate pasta for him?
Like,
and
no,
Scott is like,
no.
nope, he's eating.
But he did eat it though. He did eat it. And I think, even for me, like I've eaten whole wheat pasta and white pasta. Yes, of course, the white pasta does taste a little bit smoother. It's a little bit more refined. But at the same time, I feel like, again, the reason to eat whole wheat, if you're not familiar with these arguments, is that when you refine grains, you're removing the bran and also the germ. And so the bran has all the fiber and the germ has a lot of the protein. It has a lot of the vitamins and minerals. And so you basically just have the carbohydrates and they're digested really quickly. And so there's a lot of research linking refined carbohydrate consumption with some of these bad outcomes. And so one of the recommendations, at least from one of the textbooks I read, was that you should try to make at least half of your grain kind of choices in the sort of whole grain choices. So you can do that with, again, whole wheat baked goods like tortillas and pastas and breads. But also just, an even better thing often is to just like cook some, brown rice or farro or quinoa or whatever you want to have, keep it in the fridge, and then you can have that as well.
Instant Pot is great.
Yeah.
Too. Just a side note.
Yeah. They're not paying us for this.
Good.
We are not. No. This is not our sponsor for today. But yeah, just having a pressure cooker. Yeah, no sponsors on this channel. You get the pressure cooker. You can just sort of set it and forget it, and then go about your day. And then you have this, and you can keep it in the fridge for a week. So again, this is another example where like the planning comes into play, because it's true that if you even if you don't mind the taste of brown rice, it takes longer to cook than white rice. Yeah. And that could be a major obstacle. Like you're rushing home at the end of the day to make dinner for your kids right before you have to do bath time and bedtime, and it's like chaotic. And if the difference is between 12 minutes to do white rice and 45 minutes to do brown rice, well, like you're just going to do white rice because it's just so much easier. Mm-hmm. So I think, I don't think perfection is like what I'm aiming for here. So I'm not saying, I'm never going to eat white rice again or anything like that. It's more just, how do you bias it so that you are doing it more often and making it easier so that you don't find it too difficult or painful to do it more often. Mm-hmm. And so that was one example of something that I thought was, especially when you, if you kind of like follow Dietary, any kind of like whispers on social media, there's a lot of this like, carbs are really bad for you kind of thing. So I think it was interesting reading the book that they were saying that, like, first of all, that's not true. But then also just that if you are trying to improve it, it's not so much getting rid of carbs, but getting rid of all the, getting rid of all the added sugar, all the white flour, all the things that kind of are stripped of a lot of their nutrients and fiber and stuff.
Calories almost.
Well, definitely if you're drinking like a soft drink and they have added sugar, those are just, it's just extra calories that doesn't give you any other nutritional value, and it's very easy to consume more of it. So, I mean, that was one thing. Another thing, really like strong recommendation, is eat more fruits and vegetables. Yeah. That's another one that it's not surprising, but again, you sometimes hear this kind of like, well, fruit has a lot of sugar, so you shouldn't eat too much fruit advice, which is just like not true. Like you should eat more fruits. So if you like fruit, buy fruit and have it in your house and eat more of it. I mean, it's not to say that like if you didn't eat 40 bananas, it would not be a lot of calories, but just most people don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. Mm-hmm. I mean, one statistic I thought just blew me away, but like when they look at the diet of like typical North Americans, I don't know what the group was that was studied, and they're like break it down into categories of like what people consume. You know what the number one category is for like what people eat most of is grain-based desserts. So like pastries and muffins and things. That's the number one food category that is consumed. Like of all the categories, people get most of their calories from grain-based desserts. So I mean, like, yeah, we can do better than having most of our calories, like the largest chunk. I can eat a croissant every day. I can't. Well, exactly, right? We can do it. So,
but they taste so good.
I know.
Like, they really do. It's like
we're undermining my entire point here. Is like, let's all get a pan of chocolat right now and have some more grain-based desserts. No, but I mean, it was just startling to me that was the case. So given that backdrop where like people are getting, just this substantial amount of calories from this like highly processed, refined carbs, I can see why people have this sort of like anti-carb kind of bias in their advice. Because if you eat fewer croissants, if you eat fewer donuts and granola bars and these kinds of things, it's probably going to be good for you on average. But sometimes there's like collateral damage where like people won't eat quinoa, or people won't eat an apple because they've been told that like, carbs are the reason that you're getting fat.
But why are carbs good for you?
Well, carbs are the kind of the body's preferred energy source. So your muscle cells use carbohydrates directly. They can break them down without oxygen. This is sort of anaerobic metabolism. And so if you're doing any kind of physical activity, carbs are the thing that your body wants to consume first. And there's also the blood cells, the red blood cells in the body, and the brain is also an area where it prefers glucose, and glucose is typically, carbs are made up of a bunch of different glucose molecules, or at least simple sugar molecules that are broken down. And the problem is that if you, let's say, don't have a lot of carbohydrates, it's difficult for your body to fuel some of your physical activity, some of your, like again, the blood cells, the brain cells, they prefer this fuel, and fat cannot be converted into glucose. Protein can be converted into glucose for energy. So sometimes if you have an extremely low carbohydrate diet, then there's like sort of these metabolic difficulties we have. Now, I don't want to get into a big argument with all the like pro keto people, but I think that it was interesting to me that like when I was reading all the textbooks, I couldn't find a lot of people who were like pro that side, which, I mean, I'm not trying to say that the experts are always right about everything, but I think if I just sort of casually look on like online sources, it seems like it's about 50-50, whereas I couldn't find a single person who was like really advocating for that, who I thought was like a, you know, serious, reputable nutritionist. Now that doesn't mean that, that like high carbohydrate is always good, but just that if you are a very physically active person, sometimes going low carb can have sort of consequences on your athletic performance and these kind of things. But the advantage is that if you are not as active, if you're more sedentary, sometimes going a little bit low carb is a bit easier to eat lower calories. So I think there are reasons that people gravitate towards low carb diets, but I would just advise anyone who's interested in researching these kinds of things to, you know, look at what the standard guidelines are, because typically the guidelines are put together by people who have kind of fairly neutrally reviewed a lot of the evidence and put together. And so it's not as if the, you know, person who's putting together the standard guidelines is, you know, has this sort of wildly biased interpretation of the research literature.
Right.
Yeah.
So your goals for this month were eat fruits and vegetables, switch refined carbs with whole grain, avoid eating out, big breakfast, which, oh my gosh, you've been having like 3 breakfasts sometimes.
Mission accomplished, everyone. I've been having big breakfasts.
Well, you go for these long runs and workouts usually at 6
in the morning. Yeah.
And then when you come, I feel like from like 7 in the morning till 9, you're just eating. This was something that I thought was also surprising, because this was something that I, like, again, being kind of ignorant about a lot of these issues, I had always thought, well, I'm not that hungry in the morning, and I am trying to like maybe watch my weight a little bit and how much I'm eating. So it seemed very natural to be like, well, I'm not that hungry, so I'll just have a coffee in the morning and I'll skip breakfast, right? Because if I'm not eating breakfast, that's fewer calories, and so that's gonna be good for me, right? And so it was very interesting to read a lot of research that like that's also not recommended by anyone. That eating a bigger breakfast. Well, there's a few reasons why it's better to eat a bigger breakfast, but one of them seems to be that when they've done studies where people have shifted the calories earlier in the day, they gain less weight. And part of the reason there might be some complicated biological things like thermic effect of food and all this kind of stuff, but that's a little bit controversial. The sort of more prominent reason is that if you eat a lot of calories right before you go to bed, then it doesn't seem to have a huge impact on how hungry you are in the morning. So it's not as if, you eat a huge dinner and then the next morning you're like, well, I ate such a big dinner, I don't really need to eat breakfast now. Oh, really?
It seems to not be that related to that. And so it's kind of essentially, if you're skipping your breakfast, you're kind of, it's bad for appetite management. Whereas if you eat a bigger breakfast in the morning, you're going to be in a situation where you can stay full for longer. And then the other thing that's beneficial is that, breakfast is typically a meal that you eat at the house. You have a little bit more control over what you consume for breakfast. I don't want to generalize too much. I know there's a lot of people who eat takeout breakfasts too, but I mean, for me, I'm thinking about like, someone who's working out of the house. Your lunchtime is a little bit more constrained because you either bring a lunch or you go and you get something out of the house. And so it's a little bit, you have to make sure you pack something, but maybe you don't pack the healthiest thing, or maybe it's not enough and then you're having snacks or this kind of stuff. Whereas the breakfast you typically have more control over. And so that's a chance, I think, to kind of make those good choices early in the day. And then, have a normal size lunch and maybe a smaller dinner is probably better than no breakfast, too big lunch, and then like big dinner. That seems to be a healthier eating pattern. And definitely for me, with the exercising earlier in the day, that's also kind of shifted my appetite up too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you think that high protein breakfast is better than having something that's more high carb in the morning?
Yeah.
What do you?
I think having more protein in general is probably good for most people. This is like one of those recommended pieces of advice where there does seem to be some disagreement. Mm-hmm. So I think the people who are kind of skeptical of the eat more protein tend to be skeptical because eat more protein tends to be eat more meat. Mm-hmm. And there's maybe some, like, definitely if we're talking about eating a lot more processed meat, that's pretty much everyone thinks that that's not great for you. So, if your breakfast is like breakfast sausages and bacon, then, it's maybe not the healthiest protein source. But even things like, if you're eating a lot of chicken breast is probably not unhealthy for you. But if you're eating a lot of it, it might be pushing out some of the things from the diet that have some things that maybe are good. So if you're eating chicken breast 3 times a day, then maybe you're not having as many fruits and vegetables or some of the other things from your diet. So that's sort of the skeptical end. But the pro-protein arguments that I've heard is that, well, first of all, if you are really physically active, especially if you're doing some kind of strength training, it's probably the case that you could eat more protein and get better performance results in some ways. So it's maybe not relevant if you're not doing a lot of physical activity. Eating a lot of protein if you're not lifting weights or doing some kind of strength training, it's not going to make any impact on your muscle growth. Your body's not going to like build big muscles just because you're eating a lot of protein. But if you are doing that, then it might be beneficial. So the sports nutritionist that talked about for strength training athletes or even for endurance athletes, there is some recommendations to eat a bit more protein. But then the other reason to go more protein is that protein tends to be like, of the 3 macronutrients of carbs, fats, and protein, it's the one that has the highest like satiety. So if you just wanted to not eat so much, having a bit more protein is going to make you feel more full. So I don't know, for me, like we've been eating a lot of cottage cheese and stuff like that, just a Greek yogurt, just have a little bit and then it helps
cottage
you.
Cottage cheese with, for me, nuts. Yeah. Obviously you don't eat nuts. I would have a little bit of cottage cheese, some kind of almonds on top, a little bit of fruit, a bit of honey, just for some sweetness. And that breakfast makes me last till noon.
Yeah.
It's so good.
Yeah, so if you only ate like a sugary breakfast cereal or something, it would probably not. Like a Pop-Tart or something, it's going to have less staying power for the same amount of calories. So
I grew up in Eastern Europe. Like I never ate cereal for breakfast. That was just not a thing. And that's another
dollop
thing too.
of yogurt on everything. That's true. That's the Balkan way.
Yeah. And I noticed, especially since we've had kids, I've become very obsessed with looking at recipes, learning how to cook, planning meals. We have a family. That's just what we do. That's such a big part of our life. But now I go to the library with my kids, obviously, and my new thing is to borrow cookbooks because I find buying them just takes up so much space and I only like a few of the recipes. So now I borrow them from the library, take what I like from them and then put them back.
Yeah.
Just rip up a few pages. No, I'm kidding.
No, we've got a few. We've got like a small library of cookbooks at home already, and then we was deciding that there's no space left for cookbooks, so now we're just taking some photographs of the cookbooks.
But what I've noticed is the North American cookbooks. When you look into the breakfast section, there is a lot of sweet in there. Yeah. And then was it Lebanese? Which one was that book? That I think it was a Lebanese type of a cookbook. Yeah. The breakfast section that did not have one single sweet recipe. It was all savory things and a lot of veggies, a lot of high protein, which is
that goes back to what we were talking about earlier about this cultural idea, right? Like you have a cultural idea of what breakfast food is too, and so that's something that. Like for me, I mean, and this is just personally, but there's this, it's not even like for me, one of the things that I was trying to shift in the morning is also eating things for breakfast that are not even necessarily breakfast foods in the morning, because I don't have like a really strong commitment to like I have to eat breakfast foods, but sometimes it can feel a little weird to like make yourself like a tuna sandwich or something like that.
Not a tuna sandwich, but you've been doing like toast with like roasted veggies on top. And you would beat it.
Or even just like a bowl or something like that. But I mean, it doesn't have to be that. But I think just that idea that like, oh, well, I don't really want to eat the breakfast food. I think it's just weird that we're like that sometimes. It's like, oh, well, I don't really feel like eating whatever it is, like cereal or toast or something. So I'm just not going to eat anything. But maybe I would have eaten something else that like is because I tend to like lunch foods a bit more. So I think it's an interesting thing that we have all these like, well, you can't eat that. It's breakfast time, right? And it's just a totally made up kind of cultural sort of imposition that we have on ourselves, right?
Yeah. And what about the snacking? How do you feel about that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I like snacking. I like having food in different parts of the day and this kind of thing. So I don't think there's like, I know there's some people that really take the kind of no eating outside of windows to an extreme. Obviously, like the intermittent fasting and those kind of tend to be like taking that to its logical conclusion, like the eat one meal a day kind of approach. But I think the problem tends to be that, again, it's not, I don't think it's the issue is that like snacking itself is bad. I mean, there's even some research that shows that people who eat smaller meals throughout the day sometimes do better with this kind of stuff. The issue is just that what are the kind of foods you eat as snacks? They tend to be things that are like kind of junk food, right? Like that's it's really convenient, you know, chips and grain-based dessert products, as we've already talked about, you know, stuff like that. That tends to be what you have for snacks. So I think kind of, again, going to this planning idea, if you have snacks or things that you are acceptable for you for snacks that are healthy, then that's like a good thing to do, you know? Yeah. So like, I don't know, for me, fruit, like keeping lots of fruit in the house has been a big one because I like eating fruit and I'm happy to like, you know, I'm hungry, I'll just have like an apple or something. But
someone is always there to share it with you.
Yeah, the kids always want to eat my food when I start eating it. Yeah. The little one comes up and is like wants to nibble on the food that I'm having. But I mean that's that's like sort of a way of thinking about it. I think the way that I had kind of thought about how do you improve your diet before, and maybe this is just from like the culture, the sort of osmosis of like how do I see other people thinking about it, is from this lens of like restriction, is this lens of like don't do this, you know, that's evil, don't do this. Like that's this kind of common way of thinking about it. Whereas the sort of way that I'm trying to cultivate now is not worrying about that so much, but just like, do I always have options that are good and that I can make that good choice if I want to? And so, you know, if you like to eat fruit, have fruit. If you like to eat, you know, carrots, have carrots. If you like to have some hummus or some, you know, I don't know, we like those Mary's
those
crackers.
Are so good. Those crackers are
I mean,
so
I don't know. I think those are pretty good too. And also not
our
a sponsor.
Favorite, yeah. The dates. We like dates with dark chocolate. And I like
a little
almond
bit,
butter. Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, and I think just having those kinds of things around, so that like if your dessert is a date with a small piece of dark chocolate,
and this is the thing too, in terms of like sugar, the amount of sugar or how many calories it has. 2 or 3 dates might have the same amount of sugar as like a piece of cake, but it's probably better to eat the dates because they're higher in fiber. They're more satisfying.
I don't know enough research about dates specifically to give like a very strong recommendation or dismissal of dates. But I think like generally speaking, the more you're eating like whole foods is better. So my instinct would be to say that dates are better than cake without even like looking into it. I mean, it's interesting because there's lots of like, there's these recommendations at the very high level, which are things like avoid ultra processed foods and eat more fruits and vegetables and have whole grains. But then it like filters down to these extremely specific things that are about particular food items. Like for instance, dark chocolate is often like recommended as being a healthier food. And I was kind of confused at first because if you look at a dark chocolate bar,
it has a lot of fat.
It has a lot of saturated fat, which is the thing to avoid, which is kind of seems, well, if that's the thing we're telling people not to eat, you know, that's why you shouldn't be having, you know, butter and things or lots of red meat or drinking like a lot of whole milk per se. Like I know some people are okay with that too, but if that's the reason for the recommendations, well then why is eating dark chocolate okay? Well, it turns out that the kind of fatty acid that is in the saturated fat in dark chocolate is like neutral to lipid profile. So it's like one of these like extremely specific kind of pieces of advice. Yeah, because there's all these different particular saturated fatty acids, and they all have like slightly different impacts on. So it gets really complicated quickly. So again, I think there is this risk of like obsessing over everything. And I think if you can, basically, I think if everyone just sort of followed the like most vague dietary recommendations and used common sense, you would probably be like most of the way to health. Like the issue is not that. I think the issue for most people is not. Oh, well, I don't know whether X is maximally healthy for me. It's more that, oh, well, it's not convenient. And like, I know I shouldn't be eating too much of this, but I do anyways because, I was busy and there was nothing else to prepare. And, so for me, I feel like, again, those really high level recommendations of try to eat whole foods, try to eat, more fruits and veggies, unrefined products. Like if you can shift to that direction, I think you're probably.
Do you want to talk about fat a little bit, like olive oil versus butter versus sunflower oil? Yeah, one of the most interesting books I read in the month was Walter Willett's book, Eat, Drink, and Be Healthy. And this book, incidentally, so there's this website called Red Pen Reviews, and this is a sort of independent nonprofit that reviews popular nutrition books and assigns them scores based on their scientific accuracy and their healthfulness. So scientific accuracy meaning like when they cite stuff, is that representative of scientific opinion? And like, are they correctly citing their studies? Which turns out lots of books don't do that. And which is very frustrating because you can read a book that's like dense with citations and it turns out that the person is like being quite misleading with it. And that's frustrating for me as a non-expert trying to interpret these ideas. Yeah. But it's very nice that this resource scores these books. And also healthfulness, meaning that like, do the recommendations actually probably will make you healthy based on kind of consensus nutritional information. And so I was very pleased that like this book by Walter Willett, who incidentally was also the head of Harvard's, I think he was like the chair of their public health discussion. So he was sort of like also an extremely prestigious nutritional academic. But this book has like the close to a perfect score. It's like the highest scoring book that has been reviewed on this website so far. And so what was interesting is that like he spends a good chunk of the book talking about how the advice on fat consumption has changed in dietary guidelines. So it seems to me that the research, at least according to Willett and some other places I read, has pretty much always pointed out that reducing saturated fats is something you should strive for in your diet, and especially replacing saturated fats with unsaturated fats or polyunsaturated fats is good. And so there's a lot of research going back to like Ansel Keys did this seven country study where he found that like the rates of heart disease were pretty tightly linked with like saturated fat consumption. I mean, this was also done in the 1950s at a time period where I think like the country that had the highest saturated fat consumption, I think it was Finland maybe. Now I might be getting this wrong because this is just going off of memory, but it was like some incredible amount of the diet came from saturated fat, like something like 40%, like which is just not at all what would be in Finnish diets today. So it's a little bit of historically dated, this particular study, but it established this pretty clear correlation between saturated fat consumption and risk of heart disease. And there's some causal risks of like saturated fat increasing your LDL cholesterol, which is sort of this direct driver of atherosclerosis and heart disease. And so there's all like basically this fairly robust and consistent set of research pointing to this. But they were saying that like, because the sort of public health authorities thought maybe pointing out saturated fat was going to be too confusing, they kind of advocated for this low-fat diet in general. And he's very critical of that decision because he thinks that kind of the industry response to that was like, oh, you don't want fat? Okay, we'll put in lots of sugar. And it turns out that was maybe misguided. But he really recommends not trying to go for a low-fat diet in particular, not like a high-fat diet, but he's suggesting, you should be having more olive oil, you should be having more
kind of like plant oils in your diet as opposed to solid fats like from like lard or butter or these kind of things. And so, I mean, this is another area where it's like a fairly simple switch. Like if you're cooking with things, cooking it with olive oil or canola oil instead of butter is, for the most part, pretty easy. And if you really like the taste of butter, just put like a little bit of butter and put more olive oil together with it. Like that's a pretty easy switch to make. And there's some more recent studies that have been done. I'm blanking on their names, but there was a Spanish study where they like just gave people olive oil, and like that was the intervention. They just like gave people olive oil, and they had better health outcomes, because it turns out like if you shift your diet in a direction of like cooking the kinds of things that you eat with olive oil, it turns out that is good for health. And so I think that was something that I thought was interesting, not because I think it's particularly controversial, but again, this kind of like dietary online kind of information that we're getting. I mean, I don't know. I was reading other books where people are talking about how like butter is a superfood, and it's sort of like that doesn't really match up with what I've read elsewhere. So, I mean, again, I'm gonna get the angry letters from the people who are putting butter in their coffee right now. But I mean, look it up. I mean, I don't know. Read the book. Argue with him. I don't know. What do you want me to say? Right? Yeah.
And well, the only thing with olive oil though is that it doesn't sustain very much heat. So it's great for salads, and it's great to cook with a little bit. But then
we use avocado oil and canola oil and stuff. I think a lot of the research has been done on olive oil. It was a little like, it was confusing to me of whether the research recommendation was like olive oil specifically versus just kind of plant oils in general, because if you even look at like the omega-3 content, like canola oil is even better than olive oil for that. And so if you were thinking, omega-3s are good, I mean, it is ALA, it's not the fish oils, which are, that's a whole separate discussion. But if you were just looking at that, it would be like, maybe canola oil is better. But I've also read other stuff where it's saying maybe there's stuff that's not in the oil itself that's related to extra virgin olive oil that makes it healthier. So, I mean, but to me, I think that like those little nuances or details are less important than just, if possible, if you can shift from having butter or lard, and definitely nothing with trans fats, although that recommendation is also a little bit dated because recently the US has kind of outlawed added trans fats to things. And so, I mean, outside of certain kinds of products where it's like maybe I've heard also that, deep frying sometimes can create trans fat sort of unavoidably as sort of part of the cooking process. But other than that, I mean, you're just not encountering a lot of trans fats these days. Whereas, if you go back 20, 30 years where everyone was worried about saturated fat and they were on the low fat recommendation, and then the industrial, it's like the monkey's paw, whenever like, you don't want to have saturated fat, and then it's going to give like some terrible alternative that everyone's going to shift to and make health worse. And so, I mean, the trans fats definitely seem to be that thing that it was this real boogeyman. But I mean, even now, like if you get tub margarine at the store, it's not going to have trans fats in it typically, although it will probably have palm oil or something else which has saturated fat, which is like, it's again the same reason you wouldn't necessarily want to have butter in it. But again, you have to like look at the little label on there. But I mean, I think that was something that was interesting to me, that the research seemed to be fairly consistent over time. Like another one is cholesterol, right? Like I remember like, or are eggs bad for you? Like you shouldn't have too many egg yolks because they have a lot of cholesterol. But it turns out like eating cholesterol doesn't really matter so much for your like dietary cholesterol doesn't have a big impact on your blood cholesterol, which is the thing you're trying to avoid. But if you
eat a lot of saturated fat.
Saturated fat is the thing that you want to try to avoid. Yes. I mean, it's possible if you ate like only egg yolks, you might increase it enough to be like worrying. But like the Keys equation, which has this whole like how your blood cholesterol should be related to these factors, the dietary cholesterol is just such a small factor that, I mean, I don't know. Obviously, if your doctor says don't do it, then don't listen to me. But I was surprised because that was something I remember being told, like everyone's just eating egg whites, and that was advice for years. And it turns out that even in the beginning, when like Keys was doing his research in the 1950s, they already didn't think that cholesterol was on its own a super important risk factor. But again, aside from eggs and egg yolks, cholesterol tends to go with saturated fat. And so it was kind of like, I think it was one of those things where they gave the advice because they thought it would be simpler, but it turns out that like being misleading confuses people more than just giving them the full complexity of it. But yeah.
What are you going to do?
What are you gonna do?
One thing that you did this month is you did calorie tracking.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. Also, there was also the macros too. I used the macro tracker. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And beside like weighing and everything.
No, I did that like twice. I did that twice, and then I guesstimated once I got my estimates. Yeah.
So how did that go for you?
Well, I have mixed feelings about the calorie tracking, because on the one hand, there's a lot of research that shows that people who track more tend to have more success with like weight loss goals in particular. That tends to be the goals people have for their diet. But you get more success when you have sort of like tighter feedback. And so there's a strong case to be made that like if you do want to improve your diet, tracking what you eat with some kind of food logging is probably good. On the other hand, it's really annoying and tedious, and it's also not often that accurate. If you ever eat anything out of the house, guessing the calories is extremely hard. And even when you're eating things in the house, unless you're very diligent with measuring portion sizes, it can be very difficult to estimate. So even when I would be like cooking a recipe at home and putting in the ingredients that are in the recipe, it would be very difficult for me to estimate, if I made dinner for all of us and we had a bit of leftovers, exactly how much of that did I eat? Well, unless I'm weighing what I'm putting in my body, it's very difficult to do that. And so I think food logging is something that it's good to do for a period of time to develop self-awareness, to be like, this is what I'm actually eating. And so I think on that basis, if anyone is really keen to like, they want to eat healthier, maybe they've tried in the past and they've struggled, then it's very good. I think also if you were trying to deliberately lose weight, if you were thinking, I want to lose weight and I want to be successful with it, and maybe I've struggled in the past, or, my efforts haven't amounted to as much in the past, it's probably the mechanism that has the most to recommend for it, because the alternatives tend to be like rather extreme restriction diets, which are very difficult to sustain long term, either in terms of like you're only eating one meal a day, or you're eliminating like half of the food groups, and then you have risks of nutritional deficiencies and other things like this. Whereas just simply tracking how much you're eating is probably more manageable for most people, and it helps you develop a little bit of an awareness, because, for instance, if you're eating, you think, fruit is like it's sugary and this kind of thing. But if you actually track it and you're eating fruit, it's much harder to eat a lot of fruit than it is to eat like, a pastry or something like that. So you learn these things in going through it. That being said, I think not only the tediousness of it I didn't like, but also I felt like the way that it works right now is that it puts a really large emphasis on calories. The one I was doing was also tracking the carbohydrates, protein, and fat.
Like weight loss?
Well, no, just it puts that a really lot of emphasis on that dimension of what you're eating, like how much you're eating. Okay. And it's a lot harder, at least with the tools I was using, to get a good overall sense of like dietary quality. So you don't have, it's very difficult to see like, well, how like, basically, if you eat something that, it's like, let's say you just eat like a jar of like sugar or something like this, a sugar water, versus you're eating fruits and vegetables, like the calories might be the same. Mm-hmm. And so the issue is that I think sometimes it fixates you on just that dimension of what you're eating. Whereas what I was doing before was kind of a more mindful eating approach, where it's just thinking about what's healthy, thinking about, okay, well, I want to have things that are whole grains. I want to have lots of fruits and vegetables. I want to have a bigger breakfast and a little bit later in the evening. So maybe try not to eat after dinner. Like these kinds of like personal guideline rules, I think were not only less tedious as doing this, but it kind of focused me on different aspects of eating. So things like, like eating vegetables and eating a variety of vegetables was something that before I was doing more of, but then when I had to actually like track everything, it was like annoying to like put in 6 different kinds of vegetables if you're making some kind of mixed bowl. So it encourages a kind of dietary monotony, because you're not like, every time you input a new recipe, it's more work. So again, I don't think I have like a wholehearted recommendation for tracking for most people, but I think keeping a food log, at least for some period of time, compared to the status quo, is probably good for a lot of people if they, if they're sufficiently motivated that they want to overhaul how they're eating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then let's talk a little bit about the flexible food planning,
right?
Which is sort of your idea of how to go forward with this.
Yeah. So when I initially so I wrote a post on the website when we were still like in the very early days of planning this kind of project and the course associated with it. And my original idea for this month, which again was not given tons of thought, but my original idea was like, okay, well, everyone's just going to decide which foods are junk food for them, and they're going to give up junk food for 30 days. And then after, they're going to have some kind of like planned phase back in. And I've done other kind of courses where we've used that sort of model. So in our Life of Focus course, our second month is this sort of digital declutter, which follows the same kind of idea that for a month, you kind of really strongly restrict your kind of non-necessary digital device usage. And then after you're done, you kind of decide, okay, what is a more healthy way for me to use social media or my phone or this kind of thing? And I think that works in that instance. For here, I don't think it works because...
You wanted more?
No, because food is on this continuum, right?
Right.
And so I think I personally, from all the things I was reading, I feel like the whole problem is this kind of calling certain foods good and certain foods bad, and this sort of like black and white thinking about it is kind of, I think, the issue. Whereas what you want to do is just have a better dietary pattern in general. Mm-hmm. And what is the obstacle to having a better dietary pattern? And I think the major obstacle is that eating the way that you'd like to eat, if you are sort of being mindful about it, is too effortful. Either it's too effortful because the healthy options are too far away, or because the less healthy options are too convenient and accessible. And so the flexible food planning was the sort of revised idea. And this is a little bit less simplistic in terms of a habit, so it doesn't conform to like a real one-sentence recommendation. But the basic idea is changing what you're stocking in your kitchen, changing what you're buying in the grocery store, and coming up with strategies for dealing with things where you're not eating outside the house, where you're eating outside the house, so that you don't feel like, oh, well, I was trying to eat healthy, but then I blew it at that particular scenario. That, I think, if you can just, again, make a shift, so it's not like a black or white, you're only eating healthy things now, but just sort of, if you were feeling like your diet on a scale of like 1 to 10 was a 4, if you can shift it to a 7, that's like a huge improvement. Even if, sometimes you're eating things that are not healthy, 7 is much better than 4, right? So that's the idea, is like tip the scales so that the food environment around you supports healthy eating or supports the kind of dietary pattern you'd like to hold up, rather than it be this, all this sort of guilt and shame based approach where it's sort of like, oh, no, you ate that and that's bad and you've ruined your diet, and so you might as well give it up right now. I mean, I think that kind of inflexible thinking undermines a lot of really sustaining this long term, because if you're going to keep it up for decades or years, it has to be something that just feels automatic. It can't feel like you have this sort of list of strictures that you can only eat 3 things, and if it's not necessary for your health. I mean, obviously some people have, like we just talked about my allergies, some people have legitimate things they have to avoid. If you have diabetes, if you have other things, you might have to be on a strict diet. But if we're just talking about the regular person who wants to eat healthier, and there's no super compelling health reason forcing them to eat healthy every single day, then I think this is a better approach.
Yeah, so one thing that you were talking about is the dietary restrictions. And if you're trying to follow some kind of diet, and if you have diabetes or any other kind of health concerns that are limiting what you can eat. But one example I wanted to just give is that when I had my first child, when I was pregnant with Thomas, I was diagnosed with gestational diabetes, which really caught me off guard. I didn't really expect that. And it's also not something that's, it's hormonal, right? Yeah. And it doesn't mean that I don't have diabetes right now, but it's something that I had to shift my diet for a few months while at the end of my pregnancy. And I was tracking everything that I was eating. I wasn't eating pretty much nothing white. I decided that we're not going to have white bread. We're not going to have white rice.
We're having the steel cut oats in the morning.
Steel cut oats. Yeah, not even like regular oats. Yeah. I completely changed my diet. Yeah. And I did have to track everything. I mean, I wasn't tracking the calories like you did, but even just simply writing down the meals that I was having, because I had to go to a diabetes specialist doctor, and I had to show them everything that I was eating, and I had to measure my glucose levels like 3 times a day. It was very interesting and very kind of unexpected, but obviously I got through that. And a second pregnancy, I didn't have it. Yeah. This only happened in my first pregnancy, and that was just something that I was kind of dealing with, but it really put things in perspective. And hopefully, I mean, it was a temporary thing for me. Yeah. You never know, right? You never know what's going to happen in your life. But it puts in things into perspective of like, oh, okay, we're eating this way. Is that really the best option for us? Can we make food be delicious and also be healthy for us? And how can we do that? What are the little tweaks that we can make to change our diet for the better? And even for desserts, like I wasn't eating any type of dessert because I was finding everything was spiking my
date and nut
I was
balls,
gonna say I have this like amazing recipe for these protein balls. I'm sure a lot of people know something similar to this, but it's pretty much some nuts, dates. I put coconut flakes in there. And what else? Like a little bit of maple syrup, all kind of...
There you go, guys. You get a little recipe at the end of this, this conversation here.
All kind of blended together, and I make them in these little... Oh, and obviously cocoa powder as well to make them chocolatey. And they're just so good. And so whenever I really wanted something sweet, I knew that I have something there that's not
that wouldn't spike your blood sugar, I mean, I think... I think this is, there's 2 things I wanted to say. One thing was just that I think that sometimes when you have these like little, maybe it's a health scare, maybe it's some kind of dietary restriction, it makes you more mindful of what you're eating in a way that even if the health situation is itself negative, it can be kind of a positive because you're paying attention to that kind of stuff. And so we have lots of friends and family members that have had some kind of health, it could be a health crisis or it could be a warning from a doctor, this kind of thing. And then they, start to really pay attention to what they eat, which again, it's not so much that like you need to be this fanatic, but just that the default, if you just look around you, what you're eating, if you're eating mindlessly is often, not great. And so just being a little more mindful helps a lot. That was my
whole point, is that don't wait for the crisis, right? Get this kind of organized right now, so then you don't have to deal with it, at least for a while, right? But you don't have control over everything. Things happen, right? And sometimes you have to adjust things in your diet accordingly. And this was, it was definitely a good lesson for me.
Well, that was my second point, was that I think the other thing too is that, and this is true of everything in life, but it's worth underscoring here, is that all you can do is adjust your risks. You can't have 100% control over what happens to you. And so I know there is a kind of like vaguely moralizing dimension about like what you eat. And so if someone has some sort of bad health outcome, there's always going to be this group of callous people who are kind of like, oh, that's because you were doing this or this kind of thing. But life doesn't work that way. And sometimes people do everything right, and then they get dealt a bad hand, and they get some bad health outcome that like, like we know people that, they're like super healthy and slim, and then they get type 2 diabetes. And there's that kind of like, cultural blame of like, oh, well, you were eating too many candy bars. Well, maybe they weren't at all. Maybe they just were unlucky. And similarly, people can have all sorts of things happen to them that aren't their fault. And even with like probably the most prominent one is a lot of people, especially if you look at like statistics, people are more overweight, have more obesity than they did before. And there's been kind of historically this sort of moralizing dimension of it, just sort of like, oh, well, those are just the people who are just eating bad food and they're just not taking care of themselves. Whereas I know lots of people who are overweight or obese that kind of almost obsess over what they eat. They obsess over eating healthy, and they have really hard time staying underweight. And this is just because, either hormonal brain factors make it harder for them to, maintain a healthier body weight. And so I think, again,
That's
like
very true.
we need to be compassionate about.
To add to that point, I'm pretty sure that when I was at my skinniest, I was also the most unhealthy.
Yeah.
It's true.
Well, I mean, that could be true too. I think we can also, like, if you don't have weight issues, sometimes that kind of gives this sort of like license to have like an otherwise really bad diet and this kind of thing. So, I mean, I think the point here is not to sort of go down that road and have that kind of like, oh, well, if only you could have purity in diet, then you will be some kind of transcendent being who never experiences bad health outcomes. I mean, that's ridiculous. Obviously, it's just trying to make shifts in a better direction to reduce your risks, recognizing that, you don't have 100% control over what happens to your life, but that if you make steps in a positive direction, maybe you can improve your odds, even if you're not always, taking the helm and steering it exactly the way you want.
Yeah. Yeah. The book Outlive kind of.
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit in the fitness one.
In the fitness one, that kind of talks about that a little bit. And so, how did the month go for you? And do you feel like you achieved your goals? Yeah,
I mean, I think, again, this was a bit of a weird month for me because I kind of did a lot of the changes that I would have wanted to make like 3 months ago. Yeah. So this month was sort of like, well, I'm already kind of eating how I want to be eating. And I made those habit changes like 3 months earlier. So it was more of a, again, doing the food logging for the entire month was more of I wanted to gain some insight into my eating patterns. And so even though I don't plan on continuing that going forward, it was useful. And then also I feel like in terms of health outcomes and this kind of stuff, I feel like I'm pretty close to my healthiest weight right now. And I'm pretty happy with how I'm eating. There's probably some room for improvement in terms of just like getting better at the planning, getting better at those kinds of things so that even now there's probably some places where I don't have good solutions worked out and I'm going to have to find better ways of doing things. But I think, again, what I want to continue is this mindset of like creating the healthy environment, making it easier, making it more accessible to eat in a healthier way rather than layering on restrictions and the kind of, attendant like guilt and rules that go with it. So.
Yeah, and you've been cooking more, which I like.
Yes, yeah.
You've been cooking, I've been playing with the kids.
That's true, yeah.
We've been like kind of 50-50, whereas before I was doing most of
we go back and forth. I mean, I remember when the littlest one was like really little, true. And you like couldn't even put her down in the dinner time. I was chef for about 6 months. You're there. Right. But you're more of I think you have more of the spirit of the chef for me. I'm a little bit more expedient when it comes to cooking. Like you're a lot more like, no, it needs to be like this 7 minutes and not 6 minutes.
I saute things more.
So I think your meticulousness comes out in the kitchen a little bit more, and so you tend to take that role. But I mean, we switch it up, and it's nice too. Like I think, we're talking about all this nutrition stuff and healthy eating, and obviously I think that's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of food, but it really is this way to like connect with people, to spend time with your family, to share these moments, like even just we had guests come over and we like bought all these mussels and we made mussels. You
bought the mussels.
I bought the mussels.
Scott went to Costco and decided to just
like
come
buy
back
like 4
home.
kilos of mussels.
So naturally we had to invite friends over to help us eat them
all
because
the mussels,
there was live mussels in our fridge. So we're like,
taking
we don't know
the whole fridge,
how long these can stay here. We don't know what to do with them.
And we've never cooked mussels before. So that's an example of like it's not just about like, oh, you want to eat healthier, like you want to eat better. Yes. In all ways.
So let's do an update on the fitness, productivity, and money.
Yeah, so the fitness has been continuing to go well. I mean, we had a little bit of a hiccup. You actually broke your foot at home before, and so while that made it a little bit more complicated for me to organize my fitness habit because I'd been waking up in the morning, and then for a while you had a bit of difficulty getting our daughter down the stairs who wasn't doing that on her own, and so
she learned to do it on her own.
Yeah, so there was a little bit of difficulty for me, but a lot more difficulty unfortunately for you. I feel like we're doing these updates and just it's just hopefully you're not like just in one of those big giant casts when we do the final.
Don't even, Scott.
Because Yeah, it was the back last time and now the foot. So you've had, unfortunately, some
Scott
some
is sitting
bad
here
luck.
being like, I'm exercising every day. I'm getting super sexy. And I just keep injuring myself.
No, but you were doing the workouts. You were doing like the broken leg workouts and stuff.
The leg happened. First day I was kind of in denial. Second day I was pretty miserable after I got this boot and they told me I have to be in it for 8 weeks. And then third day I was like, okay, no, I'm gonna go on YouTube and I'm just like searching exercise with
broken foot,
and there was actually a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And it's been great. I mean, I haven't really been doing it every day. I'm not gonna lie, it makes me like wobbling with this thing around the house all day and taking care of our kids and kind of doing everything pretty much as normal. Like I mean, I'm not in crutches the way the injury happened. Luckily I can bear weight on it, but it's still a little bit of a struggle.
Yeah.
And so hopefully by the end of the month it gets better and I'm out of it and I start to recover. But it's been tricky. And so I've been trying to do the exercises as much as I can and hopefully it helps with the recovery.
Yeah, and I mean, just to update the other two ones real quick. So the productivity has kind of continued the same. I mean, I'm still using the same system that I kind of reworked in the previous 2 months. And it's also interesting too, because I think this kind of like full capture habit, like being mindful about where are things slipping. And I think even for me, there's just little things that I wouldn't have automatically written down that I'm being more diligent just because having that mindfulness about it. And now we're actually like, I'm mixing up the timeline here, but we're running into that part where we're teaching this in the course. So again, that's making me more mindful of it as well. Yeah. And in terms of money, that's another thing that we've been working on. Unfortunately, it's kind of ironic. We decided to like reorganize the spreadsheet, and that's put a little bit of a delay on doing our normal monthly finances. But I think it's for the best because having the new sort of way of tracking it is going to be helpful for us in, making sense of what we're spending money on and making those kinds of decisions. But we feel pretty good about that as well.
In our finance conversation. So if anyone wants to go and look at that, if they're struggling with their personal finances, maybe they'll find that helpful.
Well, anyways, it's been really fun chatting with you on camera like we do most days. And we'll be talking next month where we're going to be talking about reading. And that's going to be the next foundation we work on. All right. Take care.
Bye.